So greetings, book chasers and thrill seekers. So not only do I chase books, sometimes I actually catch them. And this is a big one that I caught thanks to Amazon, delivered a couple of days ago. But I've been waiting to unbox it with you guys. And I have to be honest, I do have the Kindle version, and I guess I could do an unboxing of that, but it would just, the ebook, it's just not the same. This little doozy of a book actually came out, I think back in October. But it was actually for a while only available in the UK. And despite the size of the box here, it's actually only one book, but it's so huge it had to be printed in 2 volumes because it's about basically everything. It's about life, reality, the nature of the universe, all sorts of great things that are near and dear to my heart. So, but before we get into the unboxing, I thought we could do a little unpacking, because this requires some setup. I know not a lot of people are familiar with this guy, although he wrote one of the books behind me right there. It's Dr. Iain McGilchrist, who actually I came across courtesy of Philip Pullman. He did a wonderful article in The Guardian about William Blake. And you all know I'm all about Philip Pullman and William Blake. But his opening paragraph, which Pullman is writing about Blake, but it really kind of brings home the way that a lot of people have come to feel about Iain McGilchrist and his work. So allow me to read it, please. And even if you're not going to allow me to read it, I'm just, sitting in a room and you're not going to be able to stop me, so I'm going to read it anyway. But it's very pertinent to what we're talking about. From Mr. Pullman. Sometimes we find a poet or a painter or a musician who functions like a key that unlocks a part of ourselves that we never knew was there. The experience is not like learning to appreciate something that we once found difficult, as we might conscientiously try to appreciate the worth of the Fairy Queen and decide that, yes, on average, it is full of interesting and admirable things. It is a more visceral, physical sensation than that, and it comes most powerfully when we're young. Something awakes that was asleep, doors open that were closed, lights come on in all the windows of a palace inside us, the existence of which we never knew existed. That is some great stuff, and I tell you what, once you get into Iain McGilchrist, you're probably going to feel the same way. He's actually got all sorts of videos and stuff on YouTube, including a great one, where he's being interviewed by Philip Pullman of His Dark Materials fame, and I'm going to put a link in the description, assuming I ever get this up on YouTube. But basically, so Iain McGilchrist is an interesting guy. British guy. He started out as an English major and an English professor later at Oxford. He was later inducted. He was a fellow of All Souls College, which is incredibly difficult to achieve. It's like apparently one of the hardest exams on the planet in order to get into that program. But he wound up writing a book called Against Criticism, which unfortunately is out of print, or I would be ordering that from Amazon too. But it kind of takes the Wordsworthian line of like we murder to dissect, and he's saying that we kind of in our analysis of literature we kind of kill it at the same time, because we're taking something that is essentially alive and rich and full of meaning and purpose, and we're just putting it in a lab basically and cutting it up. And that actually follows with a lot of his work on the human condition in general. But anyway, at some point in his 20s, he actually started studying medicine, and he worked as a psychiatrist for a long while, and I think he did a lot of work on like neuroimaging and that sort of thing. But probably the work he's most famous for is his work with the brain hemispheres. And he's fought an uphill battle because, he's had to debunk a lot of shall we say, pop culture myths that have been in operation for a while. Like, for instance, we all know we have a right and left brain, a right and left hemisphere, rather, in our brain. And there was a lot of pop psychology for a while that basically went along with, it's, the left does reason and language and that sort of thing, and the right is kind of pink and fluffy, and it does, art and creativity and just wants to sit around and paint pictures of trees and all that sort of stuff. Basically, all that sort of thing, Dr. McGilchrist debunked. And it's not so much that the right and left we now know that the right and left hemispheres of the brain and point of fact are involved in practically everything we do. The big difference is the way they experience and interpret and assimilate life is completely different. He knows this primarily just by studying patients that have had, say, a stroke in the right hemisphere versus a stroke in the left hemisphere. You get very, very different results. So yes, I guess the overriding theme of his work is that, contrary to popular belief, the right hemisphere is actually, it's far more grounded, it's far more embodied. Not only is it more creative and poetic, but it's actually far more in touch with the real world than the left hemisphere is. So the right hemisphere is more likely than not, back to William Blake when he was talking about seeing a world in a grain of sand and a heaven and a wildflower, or when Wordsworth was going off about there was a time when every meadow, grove, and stream, the earth and every common sight to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and freshness of a dream. The right hemisphere is actually the hemisphere that he was using to see and experience the world. And I guess before we get into the actual, I know we said we were unpacking a lot of this, before we get into the actual unboxing, I guess I should talk a little bit about one of the things about McGilchrist's work that really resonated with me. As an English major, as you all know, but in point of fact is poetry. And actually during the pandemic, Dr. McGilchrist was kind enough to actually read a poem a day on YouTube, which it's still available and you can still find all of them, and they're great because he has, the great British accent and all that sort of stuff, which I can't even, begin to compete with here, obviously. So you're stuck with me. But I suppose I would just like to say so much of our interactions with reality, if you want to think of it as reading reality, that's what we do. And as it turns out, the left hemisphere, obviously there has to be both, but the left hemisphere has some issues. In point of fact, the book behind me, The Master and His Emissary, that was his first book, Dr. McGilchrist's first book, sold over 100,000 copies. And it basically posits that the right hemisphere of the brain is actually the master and the left hemisphere is the emissary. The problem is the left hemisphere often thinks of itself as the master, and that's kind of where we get into trouble. And one of the interesting things about Dr. McGilchrist's work is that he first off just juxtaposes all the science and the psychology, and as it pertains to unique individuals, he then juxtaposes it against society at large, and just kind of what's been going on, particularly in the Western world for the past couple hundred years, especially since the Industrial Revolution, and how the left hemisphere has actually shaped a lot of the way, again, that we see and feel and experience the world that we live in. And as I said, a lot of this comes back to poetry. And I remember Joseph Campbell once saying that, America sadly is one of the most poetically bankrupt societies that have ever existed. I mean, poetry's obviously been something that's been with us since Babylon and Sumeria, and probably the Fertile Crescent in some oral traditions. But I'm trying not to channel Robin Williams at Dead Poet Society here. And that, we don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we're members of the human race. I would also like to add on, we read and write poetry because it can essentially say the unsaid. It can say things that we can't otherwise say. I've often likened to prose, it's kind of just a very one-dimensional thing. I mean, it's not unlike stick figures when you're drawing, as opposed to poetry, what still is working on, it's just a flat sheet of paper, one-dimensional, but it can give the illusion of having a vanishing point. It can give you the illusion of having multiple dimensions, and it resembles something more closely aligned with reality. And as I said earlier, the right hemisphere doesn't necessarily have a language that it uses, but if it did have a language that it would use, poetry would be that medium. So poetry is very, very important to this entire discussion. Yeah, and this also brings us to the idea of metaphor. Iain McGilchrist, again, being an English professor, an English major, and all that sort of good stuff, very big on metaphor. But it offers a much more nuanced and meaningful and subtle and layered interpretation of the world than literalism does. I mean, just think about all the hells that have been unleashed on this earth from people who have to take everything literally. And yet, so to any of you who've read one of my former works, The Star Wars Heresies, you know how important poetry is, particularly to Star Wars, George Lucas. Again, you just follow this line all the way back to Joseph Campbell. And one of the best compliments I ever got was somebody on my now defunct Star Wars blog saying that, that Star Wars heresies had gotten them to read life as poetry as opposed to prose, which is probably one of the best compliments that I've ever gotten, because that's basically what it's all about. So if you want a much more nuanced approach to life, that's the method you're going to have to do it. And granted, I'm making all this very complicated stuff very simple, but nonetheless, I think, and basically the right hemisphere, it also just, much like poetry, it's all about, it's showing you connections, it's showing you associations, it's showing you shades of meaning, it's showing all sorts of things that the left hemisphere, again, that left hemisphere is not very good at reading faces, it's not very good at body language, and it's not very good at reading poetry, surprisingly. So that's an angle that I particularly just want to hit. And I know I'm reminded of Aldous Huxley, who talked about that the mind is pretty much or could be thought of as a kind of reducing valve. It kind of reduces the world for us rather than expands. And of course, as opposed to like William Blake's, if the doors of perception were cleansed, mankind would see everything as it is, infinite. And of course, Aldous Huxley got the name of his book. That quote is from The Doors of Perception from Blake. So it all nicely ties together. One way or the other, it all ties back to William Blake. I don't know how. I should mention that Philip Pullman, of course, is the president of the Blake Society in London. And Iain McGilchrist, I think that was the first time they met back in 2018 or 2017, something like that, where Dr. McGilchrist actually gave a lecture at the Blake Society, and I'll put a link to that in the description because it's certainly one of the best talks that he's ever done, and it is just awesome. And one other thing I would like to say about the left hemisphere, and again, this is condensing all of this to like basically nothing. But one of the things that really struck me was the left hemisphere's not only its inability to understand metaphor, but it basically just takes everything literally. And in point of fact, people that have had like right hemisphere strokes and things have reported suddenly, the world is just very flat. It's very one-dimensional. It's very linear. It's just it's just essentially been flattened out, hollowed out, if you will. And so again, if a society is employing the left hemisphere over the right hemisphere and applying that philosophy of the world at large, well, that's pretty much what we have on our hands now. And another thing along those lines, another thing about the left hemisphere is that it makes everything abstract. It makes everything conceptual. We're not, and again, this gets very Zen too, but we're not living in the world as it is. We're kind of living in the world as it's described. And again, this has been neurologically observed many, many times. But it's, as Alfred Korzybski, the semanticist I think he was, basically said, it's mistaking the map for the territory. And again, the left hemisphere is more interested in the blueprints than the actual building. So that, again, this is why that book is so important. So without further ado, if anybody is still watching, which they probably aren't, I'm going to have to do a lot of editing here, assuming I can figure out how to edit. But let's get the book, shall we? And again, this is long. This is the work of the Iain McGilchrist life. I think as far as word count goes, it's in point of fact has a longer word count than greater word count than the King James Bible. So let's open it up, and I'm going to be like a kid on Christmas morning. Y'all can all imagine me just with my face pressed against the window, waiting for the Amazon truck to arrive. But here we go. The Matter with Things. And it took him 10 years to write that. And it's probably going to take me like 10 years to get it out of this box. But we're going to see. Oh, wow. Okay, this is the good stuff. And it is really thick. Okay, and I think they're the two... Let me get the box out of the way. Yeah, the two books are... Let me see, I missed there. Yeah, they're actually joined. So let me unwrap it here. And we can delve into it a little bit. And of course, the matter with things, the whole, as he said, it's a pun. It's not unlike Alan Watts' great book, Does It Matter? And then it was subtitled Essays on Man's Relationship to Materiality. So does it matter? Yeah. And basically the matter with things is the fact that there are no things. There are only processes. And the matter with things, our brains, our delusions, and the unmaking of the world. And this is volume 1. And again, and I love the little blurb on the back of it. It's very simple. This is one of the most important books ever published. And yes, I do mean ever. And that is from Charles Foster, who's a professor at Oxford University. So a nice little recommendation there. So this is, oh, and it's kind of scuffed up a little bit on this side. Wow. But yeah, the print isn't that bad for those of us with older eyes. We can actually see it is, to say it is bent up a little bit, but that's okay. And this is the second book, and it deals with kind of, again, the first book kind of deals with, the first volume rather, deals with the neurology and kind of the science behind this whole project. This more kind of deals with the philosophy, the philosophical ramifications, and all that sort of good stuff. And these paintings are actually hanging in Dr. McGilchrist's study. So if you ever see him talking on YouTube or something, that's where the paintings came from. So let me see. So he covers all sorts of just amazing topics in this, like attention, perception, judgment, apprehension, emotional and social intelligence, cognitive intelligence, creativity. He also tackles ideas such as what is truth, reason, science, intuition, imagination. The coincidentia oppositorum, which was a phrase that Alan Watts used to use all the time, and just how the one relates to many, time, flow and movement, space and matter, matter and consciousness, value, and then we get into the last bit, which is the sense of the sacred, which is what I'm really, really, really anxious to get into. And Philip Pullman himself even said how moved he was by the last part. So yeah, these are books that you can spend the rest of your lifetime reading, basically. But it's so cool, I had to share it with you guys. Okay, so and basically to end on, I just wanted to read the introduction, or basically the first paragraph. I'm not going to read the whole introduction. Actually, Ian does that himself online, and it's a really long introduction. But I will read the first paragraph just to kind of give you all an idea, a further idea of what we're talking about here. This book is an attempt to convey a way of looking at the world quite different from the one that has largely dominated the West for at least 350 years. Some would say as long as 2,000 years. And actually, if you want to trace the problems back to Plato and Pythagoras like I do, it's actually more like 2,500 years. But I believe we have systematically misunderstood the nature of reality and chosen to ignore or silence the minority of voices that have intuited as much and consistently maintained that this is the case. Now we have reached the point where there is an urgent need to transform both how we think of the world and what we make of ourselves. Attempting to convey such a richer insight is the ambition of this book. So again, it is not a small ambition, and doggone that it's kind of bent a little bit. It kind of messed up in transit, I guess. But yes, it's published by Perspectiva Press, I believe is the name of it. And of course, you can get it on Amazon now. And of course, it just went black on me. But yes, Perspectiva Press, and you can purchase it at Amazon. I'm going to leave the link in the description, along with all the other things I'm going to leave in the description. Again, assuming I can ever figure out how to get this on YouTube and successfully do so. But anyway, well, thank you guys so much. And again, go watch and actually go check out some Iain McGilchrist videos, because I understand not everybody has the time to delve into these. But watch the video. He's just warm and wonderful and wise. And again, he's got a great accent and everything else. So I would highly encourage it in any way. Thank you guys for joining me, and have an outstanding, let's just say it, right hemisphere day. Thank you.